right, so I want to go over the review with you and try to knock this out in 30 minutes or under. We're looking at a review for the Atlantic system in Africa. We're looking 1550 to 1800. So a couple of the things that you should be familiar with, some of the things that you should be comfortable describing is you should know about the term charter companies. So we talked about something related to charter companies. We talked about something called a joint stock company. This is a related term. These charter companies, these are private investors. These are people that are going to look to help make investments possible in the new world. These charter companies are private investors. That means you're choosing to buy stock in a company. And as you choose to buy stock in companies, you might remember this does a couple of things. It spreads out the risk as well as you share the profits. And this is how people are going to afford to make it to places like the West Indies, places like the Caribbean, to finance sugar plantations. And also, as England and France, they have a bit more of a hands-off approach to colonies in the New World. They're going to actually pay money. They're going to pay a fee to France and England for the right to set up these colonies in the West Indies. And in fact, with this fee that they're paying to countries like England and France to set up these colonies, they're also ensuring that they have a monopoly. That by paying this fee, France and England say, hey, we're not going to let any other companies come in this particular area. This colony is all for you. So that is a chartered company. We also see one company in particular that you should know about, which is the Dutch West India Company. Now, this whole region that we're talking about with like Cuba and Barbados and Jamaica, we generally call this area the West Indies. The reason we do that is because Christopher Columbus, you might recall, was trying to get to India, trying to get to what he called the Indies. That's all those islands that are in the Indian Ocean, and Columbus was wrong, obviously, but he thought that that's where he was. So that's what we still, the location is wrong, but the name stuck. We still call that entire region the West Indies to this day. And one of these companies was the Dutch West India Company. And you might remember, if you're Dutch, you're from the Netherlands, you might remember that the Dutch create a sea-based empire. They're not a large country. They're not an oppressive physical empire in Europe. They're a real small country, but they put a lot of money in their navy. And then think about the Dutch West India Company. Even though it has the word company in it, it turns out, ironically, it was not a charter company in the way we usually think about it. I just mentioned to you earlier that charter company is private investors. Private investor means just like an ordinary person, just a regular guy who buys stock in a company. It turns out that even though the Dutch West India Company is called a company, it was not. It was not a private investors working together. And actually, the Dutch West India Company was a name for the Dutch Navy. The Dutch had a navy that they put together, and they used their navy to harass and to try to take territory away from rivals in the Caribbean, because the Dutch realized that there's money to be made with sugar and money to be made moving slaves. And so this Dutch West India Company, they do a lot of things that regular companies do. They grow sugar. They do things like they move slaves, enslaved Africans from Africa to the New World. They do pay stockholders, though, like I've mentioned to you, that in a traditional company, if you do well, that you get stock and you get paid depending on how well the company does. So they do those things. But the thing is that this was not a private company. This was actually the Dutch government itself. It would be like if the United States government took over the company Google, or if the US government took over Amazon. And you still could buy Amazon stock, you could buy Google stock, but it's actually owned by the United States government. That's how this Dutch West India Company was. It was actually the Dutch government running a corporation for money, and mainly sugar, and the enslaved African trade was a whole part of that. And that leads us again to number 3, sugar and slavery. Really, There may well have been no such thing as slavery as we know it in the Atlantic system if it wasn't for sugar. Sugar was in incredibly high demand. This is why Europeans took to the seas. This is why Europeans wanted to find an alternate route around the hold that Italy and the Ottoman Empire had, was this tremendous demand for sugar, and this demand for sugar required more laborers. And so the more sugar Europeans consumed, the more Africans that they needed, and they brought them over. And sadly, these two are tied together. I think that in the textbook it said there was two ships that dominated the Atlantic system. It was the slave ship from Africa to the New World and the sugar ship from the New World to Europe to satisfy the desires of the European diet. So these are the two most important institutions we see: the sugar plantations and the transatlantic slavery. Number four, the cost of indentured servants. You might remember an indentured servant is a poor white European. These poor white Europeans cannot afford the cost of a ticket from Europe to America, but they want a ticket from Europe to America because they want a new life. Things haven't worked out for them in Europe. There's very few chances for advancement. And poor white Europeans come over as indentured servants early on. And the thing about an indentured servant is you're only going to work a couple of years. In fact, you might work for 3 to 4 years, and after your 3 to 4 years, you've paid off your debt. After 3 to 4 years, you've paid off your ticket, and after 3 to 4 years, you are now free to go your own way. But we've realized that there's a problem, because if you're a poor white European coming to the West Indies and you've paid off your debt and you are now free, the thing about land in the West Indies is at the time it was incredibly expensive. And so you can't afford to stay there. You've worked your 3, you've worked your 4 years, you're free now, but you decide to move somewhere where the land is much cheaper, places like Virginia. And so it became actually very hard to attract white Europeans to move to the West Indies. And instead, on the review, it says that we see something else happen. It says the cost of indentured servants was only half of what it cost to bring in enslaved Africans. Now, the bummer about that is, from a white European point of view, is that yes, it costs less for an indentured servant, but what happens after 3 to 4 years? What happens to my indentured servant after a few years? Well, they're free, and so there's no sense of longevity. There's no sense that these indentured servants are in it for the long run. And so they start looking, and now it becomes increasingly difficult to keep white indentured servants coming to the West Indies. Disease is a factor. Hurricanes regularly are a factor. The brutality of the sugar industry is a factor. So they're looking for solutions. You can't get Native Americans, because 95% of the Native Americans have died out from diseases, mainly like smallpox. White indentured servants are rather going to Virginia, where the conditions are not as severe, they're not as harsh. The white indentured servants who do come bail after 7 years, and so it says that they actually move to enslaved Africans who may cost more to acquire, but you keep them their entire life, and if they have children, their children are locked into this cycle of slavery. Now, number 5, the average life upon arrival of for enslaved Africans. Now, these are really sad numbers, but once you arrived in America, the average lifespan in the West Indies was 7 years. So you come to America, the Americas, West Indies, at age 20. By age 27, due to overwork, due to disease, due to difficulties of the job, after 7 years, you pass away. And that's a terrible number. But the thing is that sugar is so lucrative that you can just, as enslaved Africans die, we can afford to bring in more and more and more and more. And this terrible cycle of sugar equals slavery continues and continues and continues. Now, number 6, there's a problem. And real quickly again, so if you're getting 7 years out of an enslaved African, that's more than the 3 to 4 years you had with a white indentured servant. And if there's any children, those children pass on this legacy of slavery. So number 6, what are some problems with growing sugar on these plantations in the Caribbean? Well, one of the problems is that all these islands are covered with tropical rainforest. They're heavily wooded, and that's not going to work if I have a sugar plantation. So what do I need to do to those wooded areas? I need to chop them down. And so we see pristine forested areas these pristine forested areas being chopped down. That's a problem. The natural environment, destroyed and altered. And also, once they have the land deforested, they start planting sugar cane. They plant it, they harvest. The next year comes, they plant, they harvest. Next year, they plant, they harvest. And if you continually, because the profits are just astronomical, how much money we can make from selling sugar, if we continually to plant, and harvest without allowing the soil to rest, without renewing the soil through sound farming methods, then it's going to lead to something called soil exhaustion. And that's where all the nutrients are being removed from the soil, all the nitrogen that was needed isn't being replaced. It leads to soil exhaustion. And what are Europeans going to do when they start realizing that the land's not producing how it used to? Well, they just look at that island next to the island they're on and say, well, let's just move on to the next island. Let's deforest this island. Let's move on to the next island. We'll deforest that. And we'll just continue to sow and plant and reap sugar. And when that island stops being productive, we'll just move to the next one. So this pattern of deforestation, of soil exhaustion continues. And the third thing that happens that ruins the environment of some of these islands, so they're bringing in non-native species. Remember, there's something called the Columbian Exchange. And the Columbian Exchange is bringing animals and plants, things that have never been in the West Indies, never been in the Americas, and non-native species cause environmental damage. In fact, we still talk about invasive species today in biology classes and other things of that nature. Number 7, what kind of work might enslaved children be doing on the plantation? Well, everyone has a job on the plantation. Women are working in the fields. In fact, women, you might remember, even pregnant, might be expected to work in the fields, maybe expected to return shortly after having a child, and you just take your child to the field. Men are also working in the field, but they also end up doing more specialized jobs. Men might learn to be a blacksmith, do physically intensive labor. They might be guards, night watchmen. They might do some blacksmithing, a job that physically is demanding, and a woman in general may not have the upper body strength to do well as compared to a man, it was considered at the time. But what about little kids? Well, kids could work too. In fact, little kids could start working at a young age by picking weeds, by picking up the trash. And so we're even looking at this society where enslaved children are doing work as well. They don't want to think that children are exempt or children are getting out of work, that they don't have to work. Children are part of the plantation economy. The word was grass gangs, these gangs of kids working together and just doing simple, light work. And so no freedom for these children. It says, number 8, the percent of enslaved Africans in the Caribbean. Remember that overwhelmingly these islands are people of African origin. There's this very small white minority. And so some of these islands had many as 90% African on these islands. Remember, these islands originally had Native Americans. All the brown-skinned Native Americans died from disease. We want to replace the labor. Very few white Europeans want to show up as indentured servants, so the alternative is enslaved Africans. 90% of these islands are African origin, with a small minority of whites. How do I describe this society? We call this a plantocracy. A democracy is a society ruled by the people, a monarchy, a society ruled by a monarch, and a plantocracy is a society run by the plantation leadership. And so plantocracy is a society where a small amount of white people are ruling a overwhelmingly large of enslaved Africans. How do I make this work safely? How do I watch all the enslaved Africans? How do I keep all the enslaved Africans from rebelling? Well, there's something called a driver, a slave driver sometimes. So this is a privileged enslaved African. A driver is an enslaved African who gets benefits, he gets incentives for watching out at his fellow Africans, for turning them in, and even doing some very unpleasant jobs like disciplining fellow enslaved Africans. And so if you're willing to do these things, you get benefits, but what a difficult choice that may have meant. For number 11, the term manumission is sometimes enslaved Africans could actually make extra money on the side as long as you met your quota, as long as you did what you had to. There are instances of enslaved Africans asking permission to do extra work on neighboring plantations, and they actually could get paid for some of that labor. They sometimes could grow food on their little plot of land and sell what they grew from their little plot of land. And from this extra income, there are instances where enslaved Africans purchased their freedom. They bought themselves from their masters. Sometimes an enslaved African might receive manumission as a reward for faithful service or a close relationship that there may have been some social intimacy as you worked really well together with your master or worked in the house and there was a relationship. Sometimes you would get manumission from that, or even if there was not societal social closeness, but if there's sexual closeness, if you had a child with an enslaved African, you might end up upon your death freeing your children. This is called manumission. And number 12, you would definitely want to seek manumission because life was hard. The life expectancy was particularly difficult, not only in the West Indies, but in places like Brazil, where the average Brazilian male slave would be expected to live only to age 23. Once you hit 23, you were beating all expectations of what life was like for a Brazilian male slave. And so again, if people are dying at age 23, you have to bring in more and more, which is why on all the maps we ever see, most enslaved Africans are going to the West Indies, most are going to Brazil, very few are coming to America. But what happens to the enslaved Africans to become American? There's less disease, less harsh conditions, and that allows children to be born, them to have children, and so we have exponential population growth in the United States. In West Indies and Brazil, tons of people come and tons of people die. Number 13, ways Europeans tried to end African cultural traditions. Well, in the movie we saw Amistad. I don't want enslaved Africans to work together. I don't want them to coordinate. I don't want them to be of the same tribe. If I have a bunch of people of the same tribe, they all speak the same language, guess what? They can plan, they can plot, they can rebel against me. So I need to have some strategies to make these enslaved Africans forget Africa. One of the things I could do is say, hey, we are now speaking Spanish, we're now speaking Portuguese, we're now speaking French. And if we are getting them to forget the old language, they can't have this secret communication anymore. We can punish them for speaking the old language in front of us. We can also mix tribal groups. Remember, Africans at this time, there's no like broader sense of African or Black unity. You see yourself based on tribal identity. And if I'm mixing people from different tribes and now my plantation doesn't have all Mende, my plantation doesn't have all one group, but we have various tribes together, tribes that hated each other, tribes that warred against each other, this is going to help fight rebellion and fight you from clinging onto this one cultural tradition. And hopefully you'll adopt white cultural traditions. We'll also want to make sure that we can start converting these people, that they give up the gods of Africa, they give up the beliefs of Africa. We want to try to see if we can get them to give up their polytheism or their animism, their worshiping of nature, and introduce Christianity. All of these strategies are going to help Europeans end African cultural traditions, stop looking at Africa, look to the future. Number 14, social hierarchy. If we think about all societies, sometimes there's a pyramid of power with few people in charge and a broad level of people on the bottom. And the Caribbean was no different. If you imagine a pyramid of power in the Caribbean, there's white people, obviously, there's brown people in the middle, there's black people in the bottom. And to break that up further, there's two types of white people. There's these rich, wealthy, extravagant plantation owners. And in the Caribbean, sometimes they were called great whites. They're not just white people, but they are great white people. They're wealthy, they're educated, they own plantations, they own hundreds of slaves. They were often called the great whites. But then there are poor white people. And as poor white people, they're not equal to these great whites. Sometimes we call them little whites as a vocabulary term. And these may have been indentured servants, they may have been freed indentured servants, but they were nowhere in the social class of these wealthy white people. If we have these great whites and then these little whites, then we have various mixed group peoples. You could have mestizo, you could have mulatto, and you even have free black people, people that receive manumission. Sometimes they actually own slaves. And below the free blacks would be these enslaved Africans on the very bottom. So there's also always a social hierarchy everywhere you go. And sometimes people feeling excluded from this pyramid of power sought freedom themselves. That's number 15. The word is maroons. Maroons are escaped enslaved Africans. These are enslaved Africans that took the first opportunity to run away. They ran away to the mountains. They ran away to the jungles. They ran away to places where white Europeans could not easily find them. Sometimes they hid among Native Americans. Sometimes they married with Native Americans. Sometimes they were protected by Native Americans. But people generally fight for their freedom or run when they can. And that's what we see, particularly in a place, we'll watch a video next week in Jamaica, where maroons ran for safety and protection to the forests and the rivers outside of the plantations. Number 16 is the term mercantilism. So mercantilism is an economic theory that says you should have a mother country like Britain or France or Spain or Portugal. It's a mother country. And this mother country should have colonies. The only reason you have colonies, there's one reason, you have colonies to make you money. So mercantilism is this belief that it's an economic theory. A mother country, a European mother country, should have colonies. The only reason for those colonies exist is to make you money. Furthermore, I am going to require that my colony only buy stuff from me. It would be like if the band kids are selling chocolate candies right now and everyone wants that, but I come in realizing all the band kids are selling candy for $2, and I say, you know what? No one can sell candy anymore except for me. And I bring the exact same chocolate bars and I charge $2.50 for that candy. And I ban the band kids from selling anymore. I have what's called a monopoly. And that's what France did and Spain did. They told their colonies, you can't buy anything from anyone else except for me. So they enforced a monopoly. Even if another country offers you cheaper, you cannot get it. Mercantilism, you have a mother country who has colonies, you have a forced monopoly. This is not an example of the free market. Generally, in capitalism, you have competition, Burger King, Whataburger, Jack in the Box, and they're free to compete and fight it out for the best prices and the best quality and the best customers. Mercantilism is not a free market system. There's no competition. The government runs the show. Number 17 is Atlantic Circuit. This is that whole economic system where white Europeans send manufactured products to Africa, things that they can't make in Africa, particularly things like guns. And they trade for various things, not just enslaved Africans, so that's certainly 60% or so of the trade. They trade for tropical products, they trade for ivory, they trade for various things that are found in Africa. But of course, the big moneymaker is enslaved Africans. From there, they then send it on to the New World, where those enslaved Africans will work the fields. They will produce raw materials like sugar cane, like cotton and rice. They'll send that back to Europe, and then this cycle continues and continues and continues. The worst part of the Middle Pass of the Atlantic Circuit was the Middle Passage. That is where Africans were, the enslavement process. They were sent across the Atlantic Ocean. Remember, they didn't start their slavery when they entered a boat, but when they made the walk, the several hundred-mile walk from the inland to the coast, they were often forced to become Catholic upon entering the boat. and upon entering the Middle Passage, many of them died. What led to the death? Well, we saw in the video there was abuse, there was unsanitary conditions, there was disease. In fact, we saw a scene where one woman decided to commit suicide. Sometimes people were disciplined or whipped or executed. Various things made the Middle Passage a terrible part of this enslaved Africans' experience. Number 20, most enslaved Africans, the question is, how did they become an enslaved African? And the number one reason, particularly in parts of Africa called the Gold Coast, was they were prisoners of war. Two powerful African kingdoms fought. They got in a conflict. There was prisoners of war. What to do with them? Let's sell them. Number 21, there was another way Africans became enslaved when they went to a different part of Africa called the Bight of Biafra. There was no large African kingdoms there, so no wars, no prisoners of war, so therefore no enslaved Africans unless you do something different. The second way enslaved Africans were brought into the institution of slavery was through just straight kidnapping. Same thing, walking days and weeks to the coast where they're put on boats on the Middle Passage. What kind of differences do we see between Atlantic and Islamic slavery? Overwhelmingly, if you're in Atlantic slavery, you are probably more than likely we're going to get more men than women. Men, you're probably going to be slaves. Enslaved Africans in general are going to be working in the agricultural economy, doing sugarcane or rice or tobacco or cotton, things that are very labor intensive. You're going to be doing something like that. And if you are an enslaved in the Islamic world, there's a lot more things that are going to happen. If, in fact, the most common type of enslaved African was a woman. These women would have jobs as entertainers. These women have jobs as a concubine, a sex slave. And men, if you were enslaved in the Islamic world, you were pretty much often going to be a soldier or a bodyguard. You could actually work your way up to being a general. And so even though you were enslaved, you were given jobs that were quite powerful. And we even see this later and when we talk about the Ottoman Empire and Janissaries. Number 24, what are some ways African kingdoms benefited from the slave trade? One of the reasons they benefited was, what were they getting? They were getting guns or getting manufactured products. And so actually, and I skipped one, I'm so sorry. Number 22, two types who benefited, what types of Africans benefited from the slave trade? Merchants and kings did, because we think sometimes white Europeans are the only people who benefited, but it's not true, because Africans are selling Africans, and Africans are making a huge amount of money. Kings are benefiting from all these guns coming in, all this material coming in. So some of the people most sad about the end of this transatlantic slavery were African merchants, African businessmen, African kings, because they actually benefited from the slave trade. And what are some ways African kingdoms, number 24, benefited from the slave trade? Well, as I mentioned just a few moments ago, the military, African kingdoms' militaries were just beefing up. They were becoming more advanced. They have guns now. So that was one way African kingdoms benefited from the slave trade. Their militaries improved with the bringing in of guns. And 25, last one, what was characteristic of the attitudes of African slave traders in dealing with Europeans? It's not true that they were taken advantage of. It's not true that they were basically forced to make deals. The African merchants were very specific. They said, we need this. This is the products we want. And if you don't give us the quality we want, you better look somewhere else for enslaved Africans. They were very discriminating. They were very specific and demanded high quality goods for participation in the African slave trade. That gets us through all 25. I hope you do well. I hope you prepare and that you've read the assigned reading. Good luck, and I'll see you all soon.